A seasoned police officer and his loyal German Shepherd partner were ambushed in the middle of a deadly snowstorm. Bullets tore through the frozen air, one struck the dog, and before the officer could reach him, the criminal shoved the wounded animal over a cliff. Moments later, the officer was dragged away, bound and locked in an abandoned cabin, left to freeze before dawn. But Valor, the dog everyone thought was gone, climbed back from the icy depths, bleeding and limping, determined to save the man he trusted with his life. What happened next will make you cry and believe in the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. And if you believe that no act of loyalty should ever be forgotten, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might just change the way you see courage forever. The storm had rolled into Pine Hollow the way a predator stalks its prey, slow at first, almost deceptively quiet, until the wind began to howl through the narrow streets and the snow fell in jagged sheets against the roofs. Pine Hollow wasn't a large place, just a scattering of houses tucked between ridges of pine and fir, the kind of town where people nodded to each other at the grocery store and knew the sound of their neighbor's truck. Tonight, though, the streets were empty. The world outside was a wall of white. Deputy Jack Rourke tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his department-issued SUV. At 38, Jack carried himself with the quiet composure of someone who had been through both war and peace and knew that neither lasted forever. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw shadowed by a day's stubble, he had eyes the color of storm clouds gray, unreadable but always scanning. Jack had once been a soldier, then traded his fatigues for a badge. His life had been marked by discipline, loss, and a stubborn refusal to quit, even when grief threatened to pull him under after his wife died in a highway accident 5 years earlier. Work had become his anchor. Beside him sat Valor, a 7-year-old German Shepherd with a sable and black coat that gleamed even in the dim light of the dashboard. His ears stood high, swiveling at every sound, his amber eyes focused and alert. Valor wasn't just a partner, he was Jack's shadow, a canine who had served alongside him for years, known for his uncanny ability to detect danger seconds before it struck. There was a scar along his left flank from a previous operation, a thin, pale line under his fur, a reminder that courage often came with a price. The radio crackled. "Rourke, we've had a report from a hunter about unusual activity near the Northridge storage facility. Possible contraband drop. Proceed with caution." Jack glanced at Valor. "You hear that, boy? Sounds like we've got a job." Valor gave a low woof, the canine equivalent of a nod. The SUV's tires crunched over the frozen road as they made their way toward the edge of town. The snow deepened, swirling under the beams of the headlights. Jack knew the place they were heading, an old corrugated metal warehouse left over from a logging company that had gone bankrupt a decade ago. Locals said the building was empty, but Jack had learned long ago that abandoned places were rarely as empty as they seemed. Far across town, in the small but spotless Pine Hollow Medical Center, Claire Bennett was finishing up paperwork at the nurses' station. At 35, Claire was of medium height, with an athletic build and an easy smile that rarely reached her eyes these days. Her light brown hair was pulled back into a neat bun, though a few strands had slipped free. Years of working in emergency medicine had given her quick hands and a voice that stayed calm even when the world wasn't. She had grown up in Pine Hollow, left for college, and returned after her father's heart attack made her rethink the importance of family. Claire's history with Jack was complicated. They'd gone to the same high school, drifted apart when he joined the Army, and saw each other again only in passing since his return. She respected him, though she sometimes wished he'd let people in instead of building walls around himself. She was about to shut down her computer when a voice came over the police scanner mounted on the wall. "Possible gunfire near North Ridge. Rourke en route." Claire frowned, already pulling open the supply cabinet for trauma kits. Storm or no storm, someone was going to need her tonight. Back on North Ridge Road, the SUV crawled up the incline toward the warehouse. Jack switched off the headlights before the building came into view. The metal siding of the structure loomed in the dim light like a sleeping beast. Snow coated the roof, icicles dangling from the eaves. Jack cut the engine. "Stay sharp, Valor." They moved on foot now, boots and paws sinking into snow that crunched under the weight. Jack's flashlight beam swept over the yard half-buried pallets, a rusting forklift, footprints half-filled with snow. Something was off. Valor's ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Jack froze. "What is it, boy?" Before Jack could take another step, Valor lunged to the side, shoving his partner hard toward a stack of pallets. A split second later, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the storm, and a bullet punched into the snow where Jack had been standing. Adrenaline surged. Jack ducked behind cover, scanning the shadows. Figures emerged, 3 of them, dressed in dark winter gear, their faces hidden by ski masks. Muzzle flashes lit the air as another round ripped toward Jack's position. "Shots fired, Northridge!" Jack barked into his radio, though static swallowed most of his words. The storm was killing communications. Valor darted toward the left flank, using the snowbanks for cover. Jack saw him disappear behind a stack of crates, then reappear closer to one of the attackers. The German shepherd lunged, clamping onto the man's arm with a powerful bite. The masked figure shouted in pain, his rifle clattering to the ground. But another attacker turned, aiming at Valor. "No!" Jack shouted, breaking cover, but the shot rang out anyway. The sound made Jack's stomach twist. Valor stumbled, his right shoulder jerking from the impact. For an agonizing second, Jack thought the dog would go down, but Valor pushed forward, dragging the wounded arm of the man he'd bitten. Buying Jack the time to close in, Jack fired 2 controlled shots, forcing the other gunman to retreat toward the tree line. Snow swirled thick between them. One of the masked men shouted something too far away for Jack to hear before they vanished into the storm. Jack crouched beside Valor, running a gloved hand over his partner's coat. Blood stained the fur near his shoulder. "Hang on, buddy," Jack muttered, pulling gauze from his pocket to press against the wound. The wind screamed around them. In the distance, Jack thought he heard the faint wail of a siren, but it was hard to tell over the roar of the storm. He didn't notice the dark shapes circling back until it was too late. Something slammed into the back of his head, and the world tilted violently. The last thing Jack saw before darkness took him was Valor turning toward the new threat, teeth bared, even as his injured leg buckled in the snow. The blow to the back of Jack Rourke's head came like a hammer, shattering his awareness into fragments. His knees buckled, the cold snow rushing up to meet him before everything dissolved into darkness. Valor, his chest heaving and his right shoulder bleeding freely, spun toward the movement, teeth bared. The German shepherd lunged, snarling, a sudden burst of muscle and fury despite the hot pain searing through him. But 2 of the masked men came from his blind side. One hooked an arm under his ribs, lifting him by brute force, while the other slammed the butt of a rifle into his flank. "Got the mutt," one of them grunted, his voice muffled through the ski mask. The third man, the one Jack had seen retreat into the storm moments earlier, returned with a length of coarse rope. He was tall and wiry, with a jittery energy in every movement, as though he was always on the verge of flight or violence. Even in the storm, his gloved hands moved quickly, binding Jack's wrists and ankles with a sailor's knots. "Boss says bring the cop to the cabin. Dog's no use," the tall man snapped. They hauled Jack up, his head lolling, and dragged him toward a dark shape barely visible through the swirling snow, a small, weathered cabin with a sagging roofline, half buried under drifts. 2 others, broader, heavier men, wrestled Valor toward the ridge beyond. His paws scrabbled at the ice, claws scraping for purchase, but their grip held. At the edge, the wind roared like a living thing. The drop below was steep, the ravine hidden beneath layers of snow and shadow. Without hesitation, they swung Valor once, twice, and then let go. The dog fell, twisting in the air. The impact came in a muffled whump as he crashed into the snowpack, sinking deep. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then a paw pushed through the powder, trembling but determined. He gasped for breath, the cold searing his lungs, and began to drag himself toward the slope. Above, the cabin door slammed. Inside, Jack came to in fits and starts. His head throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat, his vision swimming. The interior of the cabin was dim, lit only by the faint blue glow seeping in from the gaps between warped planks. A single table sat in the corner, a chair missing a leg propped against the wall. The air smelled of mildew and cold iron. A man stood near the door, arms crossed. His build was stocky, with a barrel chest straining against a dark winter jacket. He wore a faded baseball cap under his ski mask, and his eyes were pale, almost colorless. He had the kind of stillness that made him harder to read than the jittery one outside. Jack tried to move his hands but felt the ropes dig into his skin. "You're awake," the man said simply, his voice flat. Jack didn't answer. His mind was already working, cataloging the exits, the placement of the furniture, and the slow, steady sound of boots pacing just outside. The man in the cap crouched in front of him. "Don't try anything. Storm's too thick for your friends to find you, and your dog's already gone." Jack kept his expression neutral, but a sharp spike of dread twisted in his chest. Valor. Back at Pine Hollow Medical Center, Claire Bennett was at the emergency line again. She had already tried the sheriff's office, the volunteer rescue squad, even the old radio in the storage closet. Nothing but static. The bow had snapped the main transmission lines like twigs. Her hands, gloved against the creeping cold even inside the clinic, tightened around the phone. Claire wasn't one to panic. Years of triaging accident victims had trained her to focus on what she could control, but she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in the pit of her stomach. Jack was out there, and the storm was only getting worse. She opened the supply cabinet, loading a portable trauma kit with gauze, bandages, and a thermal blanket. If word came through, she would be ready to move. In the ravine, Valor paused to catch his breath. Blood dripped into the snow, bright against the white. The pain in his shoulder was a constant burn, but the cold had begun to numb it. Every instinct told him to rest, to curl into himself for warmth. But another, stronger instinct pushed back. Jack was still out there. The slope was treacherous, slick with ice beneath the powder. Valor dug in his claws, inching upward. Twice he slipped, sliding several feet before halting himself. Each time he got back up. His breath steamed in the freezing air, his ears flattening against the wind. When he finally reached a low outcropping halfway up, he paused to scan the ridge above. The shapes were gone. Only the cabin's faint silhouette stood against the storm, his amber eyes fixed on it. That was where Jack would be. Inside the cabin, Jack tested the knots at his wrists again, twisting subtly as the man in the cap turned toward the door. A muffled voice called from outside, something about checking the shipment and storm window closing. The man grunted and stepped out, leaving the door unlocked but guarded by the sound of another set of boots. Jack shifted his weight forward, tipping the chair onto its front legs. It creaked loudly. The guard outside muttered but didn't come in. He needed a distraction. He needed Valor. Up on the ridge, Valor reached the lip of the drop, claws hooking into a crust of ice. He hauled himself over, every muscle screaming, and collapsed into the snow on the flat. For a moment, he lay still, listening. Voices carried through the wind, faint but distinct. Crouching low, he began to move toward the cabin, hugging the cover of snowbanks and debris. His shoulder burned with each step, but the thought of Jack alone inside drove him forward. The storm showed no mercy. Snow lashed against his face, clinging to his fur, but he kept going. Somewhere inside, a part of him knew that time was running out. The cold in the cabin was the kind that worked its way into bone and marrow. Jack Rourke came to slowly, his head pounding with each beat of his heart, the back of his skull slick with dried blood. His wrists were bound behind the chair, the rope biting into his skin through damp gloves. Every breath he took came out as a pale cloud, hanging in the air before dissolving into nothing. The cabin itself was a relic of some long-forgotten logging camp, a single-room structure with warped plank walls and a roof sagging under the weight of snow. The wind hissed through the gaps in the boards, carrying with it the faint, sharp scent of pine and the constant whisper of the blizzard outside. Jack tested the ropes again, twisting his wrists. The coarse fibers scraped his skin raw. He tried to flex his fingers to keep the blood flowing, but they were already numb. His feet were bound to the chair legs, cutting off most of his leverage. A narrow wooden table stood just out of reach, its corner sharp enough to fray rope if he could get to it. Near the door, a new figure leaned against the wall, a woman this time. She was tall, in her early 40s, with a lean, wiry frame built for endurance rather than brute force. Her black parka was worn at the elbows, and her hair, a deep brown streaked with silver, was pulled into a low braid that hung over one shoulder. Her eyes were an icy hazel, sharp and assessing, set in a face lined from years of hard living. This was Marla Kane, and even without knowing her name, Jack could tell she was the kind who gave orders more than she took them. There was a stillness to her, a predator's economy of movement. The faint scar running from her temple to the corner of her mouth made her smile, if she ever smiled, look like a threat. She glanced at Jack but didn't speak. Instead, she shifted her attention to the man in the cap who had been guarding him earlier. "We don't have all night," she said, her voice low, carrying authority. "Storm's giving us cover now. By daylight, that changes." Jack listened, his jaw tight. The man in the cap shrugged. "Boss wants him gone before sunrise. Clean." Marla's eyes flicked back to Jack. "Then we stick to the plan." Miles away, Claire Bennett gripped the steering wheel of her four-wheel drive Jeep, the wipers beating a desperate rhythm against the snow, pelting the windshield. The road out toward North Ridge was a narrow ribbon barely visible in the storm, lined with thick pines whose branches sagged under the snow's weight. Her headlights swept across something ahead, a massive tangle of downed trees blocking the path. The largest pine lay across the road like a felled wall, its trunk splintered where the wind had snapped it. Claire slowed, biting her lip. Getting through would be impossible without a chainsaw, and she had none. Her breath fogged in the cab as she sat there, weighing her options. She could turn back and lose precious time, or she could try to hike in on foot with her medical kit, battling the storm. Her mind kept circling back to the scanner call, the mention of Jack's name. Claire wasn't one to ignore her instincts, and right now they were screaming that something was wrong. She pulled the Jeep to the side, grabbed her insulated gloves, flashlight, and the trauma kit, and stepped out into the blizzard. The wind slapped her hard enough to make her stagger, and the snow swallowed her up to her calves, but she set her jaw and started forward. Back in the cabin, Jack shifted his weight, forcing the chair to scrape sideways. The sound drew a glance from Marla, who moved toward him with deliberate steps. "Don't," she said simply, leaning down until they were eye level. "I've seen men try to work themselves free before. It doesn't end well." Jack met her gaze without flinching. "You're making a mistake. Whatever you think you're protecting, this won't end the way you think it will." Marla's mouth curved in that half-scarred, almost smile. "We'll see." Outside, the muffled voices of the others filtered in, two men arguing about the storm's duration and whether they could move their shipment before sunrise. Jack caught fragments references to a drop point, to keeping the cop quiet. The implication was clear. They didn't plan for him to live past the night. Far from the cabin, Valor limped through the storm, his breath coming in short, determined bursts. Snow clung to his coat, matting the fur around his wounded shoulder. He lowered his head against the wind, nostrils flaring as he caught a familiar scent. Jack's scent, faint but undeniable. The German shepherd's world had narrowed to that one goal: find his partner. Every step sent a jolt of pain up his leg, but he pressed on, weaving between snowdrifts, crossing frozen ground with the precision of a seasoned working dog. The storm distorted sound, but every so often he caught a hint of movement ahead. The creak of wood, the faint murmur of voices. His ears flicked forward. The cabin was near. Inside, the temperature was dropping further. Jack's fingers were clumsy from the cold, but he kept working the ropes, trying to find the smallest give in the knots. The coarse fibers were damp now, making them swell and tighten, but every time Marla looked away, he twisted, stretched, tested. His eyes swept the room again, cataloging details. A rusted stove in the corner, cold and unused. The narrow gap under the door where snowflakes swirled in. The single, cracked window on the far wall. The plan, forming in his mind, was desperate, but desperation was all he had left. Claire stumbled over a half-buried log, her flashlight beam swinging wildly. The wind stole her breath and made her eyes water, but she pushed forward. Somewhere in the trees ahead, a shadow moved. Not human, but low and steady. She froze. "Valor?" She called into the wind, though she doubted he could hear her. The shadow paused, then angled away, disappearing into the swirling white. Claire felt a jolt of hope, but it was quickly tempered by the thought that if Valor was out here alone, something had gone very wrong. She adjusted her path to follow the direction he'd gone. In the cabin, the argument outside grew louder, one voice insisting they finish it now before the weather cleared, the other worried about moving too soon. Marla stepped to the door, muttering something to the guard. Jack felt the shift in opportunity. He leaned forward, forcing the chair closer to the table, the sharp corner almost within reach. One more inch, and he could start fraying the rope, if the guard didn't come back in too soon. Outside, Valor crept closer, the scent of Jack now strong enough to quicken his pace despite the pain. He stopped just short of the cabin's edge, crouching in the shadows, ears forward, eyes locked on the door. He would wait for the right moment. The ravine was a frozen gash in the earth, its walls coated in slick ice and snow-packed ledges that crumbled under the slightest pressure. Valor lay at the bottom for a moment, his flanks rising and falling in shallow breaths. His right shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him, the wound stiffening in the cold, but his mind was fixed on only one thing: Jack. Above him, the storm screamed. The wind whipped through the treetops, scattering snow in blinding bursts that drifted down into the ravine like fine white ash. Every gust brought with it the faint scent of pine resin and the far-off smell of smoke human presence. Valor pushed himself upright, his paws sinking into the deep snow. The climb ahead was near vertical in places, but there was no other way. He began to move, claws digging in, using his hind legs to launch himself upward. The slope crumbled under him more than once, sending him sliding back several feet, but he refused to stop. Each failure was met with a pause, a steadying breath, and another leap forward. The wind slammed into him at one exposed ledge, nearly knocking him sideways into the void. He dropped low, ears flat, and waited until the gust passed before forcing himself to continue. His breath steamed in the air, his amber eyes narrowed against the sting of snow. Halfway up, his paw hit something solid buried beneath the snow. He scraped at it, revealing the dark metal of a pistol. One of the attackers must have dropped it during the chaos. Valor sniffed it, then gripped it gently between his teeth. The weapon's weight pulled at his jaw, but some instinct told him it could matter later. He resumed climbing, now slower but no less determined. Several hundred yards away, Claire Bennett pushed forward through the storm. Her boots crunched over snow-covered underbrush, the straps of her trauma kit biting into her shoulder. The blizzard swirled in thick sheets, making every step a battle against resistance. She paused at a break in the trees where the wind had scoured the snow down to the frozen dirt road. That's when she saw them tracks. Not the single line of a patrol vehicle, but the heavy twin grooves of truck tires, fresh enough that the edges were still sharp despite the weather. Claire crouched to study them, brushing away loose snow. The tracks were wide-set, likely from a large delivery truck or transport vehicle. They led away from the direction of the Northridge warehouse toward the deeper woods, the same area where Jack had gone silent on the radio. A knot tightened in her stomach. If those were the criminals' tracks, they might be moving whatever shipment Jack had mentioned before. Communications failed. It meant they were organized, and worse, it meant Jack might already be on the move, under their control. She straightened, scanning the woods. The smart move would be to mark the spot and return to town to report it, but with the storm severing communications, the information might never reach anyone in time. Claire adjusted her pack straps and chose the harder path, follow the tracks as far as she could, at least until she had no choice but to turn back. Back in the ravine, Valor reached the final stretch. The top was close now, just a few body lengths away, but the slope steepened, the snow crust thin over slick ice. He placed the pistol carefully on a narrow ledge, then leapt upward, claws scrabbling for purchase. His hind legs kicked snow into the wind. A sudden gust slammed down the ravine, rattling the branches above. Valor lost his grip and slid several feet, his injured shoulder screaming with pain. He growled low, digging his claws into the ice, and with a final burst of effort, hauled himself over the edge. He lay there a moment, chest heaving, before picking up the pistol again. The forest spread out ahead, snow-laden pines, tangled undergrowth, and the faintest trail of disturbed snow that could have been left by boots. Valor's ears pricked, catching a muffled human voice in the distance, almost lost to the storm. Claire's path curved downhill before climbing again toward a ridge. The truck tracks continued ahead, weaving between trees. She quickened her pace, ignoring the protest of her muscles. At one bend, something caught her attention, a smear of red on the snow near the track's edge. She crouched. The blood was fresh, still vivid against the white, and there was no sign of an animal struggle. A single set of paw prints led away from it, deep and staggered, as though the animal was favoring one side. Claire's breath caught. German Shepherd tracks. "Valor," she whispered, glancing in the direction the tracks led. Without hesitation, she left the truck trail and followed the paw prints into the thickening storm. Valor moved through the forest, keeping low. The cabin's scent was closer now, mingled with the acrid smell of gasoline and the faint tang of unwashed wool clothing. His pace was slow, both from caution and the weight of the pistol. He skirted a low rise and froze. Ahead, through a break in the trees, the outline of the cabin emerged, half shrouded by snow-laden branches. A faint light spilled from a crack in the boarded window. The voices were clearer now, low, tense, and arguing. Valor set the pistol down behind a snowbank and crept closer, every muscle taut. He could smell Jack now faint, but enough to quicken his heartbeat. Claire crested the same rise from the opposite side, the storm masking her approach. She spotted the dark shape of the cabin and dropped to her knees behind a drift. Her pulse hammered in her ears. If Jack was inside, there could be armed men guarding him. She scanned the area for movement and caught sight of something near the far corner of the cabin, a flash of sable and black fur moving low to the ground. Claire's chest tightened with relief and fear all at once. Valor was alive but wounded. She stayed still, not wanting to distract the dog. If Valor was here, it meant Jack wasn't far. At the cabin's edge, Valor crouched behind a pile of firewood, his breath visible in the frigid air. He was so close now he could hear the scrape of Jack's chair legs against the floorboards, his muscles coiled, ready for whatever came next. For the first time since the fall into the ravine, he allowed himself a flicker of certainty he would reach Jack. No matter what stood in the way, he would get him out. The door of the cabin crashed open, letting in a brutal gust of wind and a swirl of snowflakes that danced in the pale glow of the single hanging bulb. Jack Rourke squinted against the sudden brightness outside as two of the masked men stepped inside, their boots leaving wet prints across the warped floorboards. One of them was the tall, jittery figure Jack had seen earlier, his movements sharp, restless, eyes darting beneath the rim of his ski mask as though every shadow threatened him. The other was heavier, broad through the shoulders, with a neck thick as a tree trunk and a deep voice muffled by the wind. The heavy-set man carried a length of thick rope, already coiled, as though this had been decided long before they came for him. "On your feet, cop," the heavy-set one growled, gripping Jack by the arm and yanking him up so hard the chair legs screeched across the floor. The rope around his wrists dug deeper, sending a jolt of pain up his arms. Jack didn't resist yet. He needed the right moment. The tall man opened the door wider. The storm outside was a wall of white, the sound of the wind like 1,000 distant screams. "We dump him at the ridge," he muttered. "Snow will bury him before daylight." Jack's mind flicked through options, each one ending in a fight he wasn't sure he could win bound and outnumbered. But as they dragged him toward the door, something in the storm shifted, a movement too deliberate to be just wind. Out of the swirling snow came a dark shape, low and fast, closing the distance with the speed of a thrown spear. Valor burst into view, his coat bristling, teeth bared in a snarl that carried over the roar of the blizzard. The German shepherd's eyes locked on the tall man's weapon, an assault rifle slung loose at his side. With a burst of strength that defied his injuries, Valor lunged. His jaws clamped onto the man's forearm with a force that ripped the weapon from its ready position. The tall man screamed, stumbling backward, his free hand flailing. The rifle dropped into the snow. "Valor!" Jack's voice was hoarse, but it carried both relief and warning. The heavy-set man reacted quickly, swinging the coil of rope like a club. It struck Valor's side with a dull, brutal thump. The dog's body rocked with the impact, a sharp whimper tearing from his throat, but his grip didn't loosen. He braced his paws in the snow, using his weight to drag the tall man off balance. Jack seized the moment. As the tall man fell, Jack twisted, slamming his shoulder into the heavy-set man's gut. They stumbled, their boots slipping on the icy ground outside the cabin. Jack dropped to his knees beside the fallen rifle, his bound hands fumbling for the grip. The heavy-set man recovered first, lunging toward him. Jack rolled sideways, the weapon trapped awkwardly in his bound wrists, but he managed to swing it up just enough to make the other man hesitate. Far off, Claire Bennett was fighting her way through the woods, her boots punching into snowdrifts up to her shins. The storm muffled most sounds, but then there it was. A sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot. Her head snapped toward the direction it came from. She couldn't see through the trees, but her instincts screamed at her to move. She picked up her pace, ignoring the burn in her lungs, pushing herself faster, the sound of her own breath drowned by the thundering of her pulse. Back at the cabin, the tall man had managed to wrench his arm free from Valor's jaws, leaving a ragged tear in the fabric of his sleeve. His forearm was bleeding, the wound bright against the snow. He staggered back, grabbing for the pistol at his belt. Valor pivoted instantly, his body low, teeth bared again. The heavy-set man barked an order something about "shoot the dog," but Jack didn't give them the chance. He slammed his shoulder into the taller man's chest, forcing him backward into the doorframe. The pistol went skidding across the floorboards into the shadows. The three of them struggled in the doorway, snow and cold air pouring in. Jack used the chaos to twist his bound hands under his legs, bringing them in front of him. It wasn't much, but it gave him just enough reach to grab the pistol from the snow at his feet. The heavy-set man froze when he saw the weapon in Jack's grip. Valor moved to stand between Jack and the tall man, a low growl vibrating in his chest despite the way his sides heaved from exertion and pain. "You're done," Jack said, his voice hard despite the strain in his body. Claire crested a low hill and finally saw the cabin ahead, a squat, weather-beaten structure huddled under the weight of the snow. In the doorway, she caught flashes of movement. A man stumbling back, Jack in a half-crouch, and Valor, fur matted with blood but still standing. Her stomach clenched at the sight of the dog's condition, but she didn't stop. She gripped the strap of her trauma kit tighter and kept moving, closing the distance as fast as she could without drawing attention. Inside the cabin's threshold, the wind roared, snow swirling around them. The heavy-set man backed away, hands up, eyes darting between Jack's pistol and Valor's teeth. The tall man muttered something under his breath and glanced toward the tree line, calculating escape. "Don't," Jack warned, his fingers steady on the trigger. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the distance, a new sound cut through the wind, the faint, rising wail of a siren. Backup, though still far away. The distraction was enough. The tall man bolted toward the trees. Jack didn't fire. He couldn't risk hitting Valor, who lunged after him, only to stagger slightly from the pain in his ribs. The heavy-set man took the moment to shove past Jack and follow. Jack lowered the pistol, his chest rising and falling heavily. He turned to Valor, kneeling in the snow. "You held on, boy," he said quietly, one hand pressing against the dog's side where the rope had struck. Valor's eyes met his, and despite the storm, there was a flicker of calm between them. The siren grew closer. Jack knew they weren't safe yet, but thanks to Valor, he was still alive. The sirens were still distant, their faint wail swallowed by the roar of the blizzard. Jack didn't trust the sound to mean safety, not yet. He quickly scanned the tree line, making sure the two men who had fled weren't doubling back. The storm was a living, shifting wall around them, and it could just as easily hide enemies as it could hide them. With numb, clumsy fingers, he used the small folding knife he'd taken from the tall man's dropped gear to slice through the last of the coarse rope biting into his wrists. The relief of movement was fleeting. His arms burned from circulation returning, and his breath fogged heavily in the freezing air. He knelt beside Valor, running a hand down the dog's neck, feeling the tremor of cold and strain in every muscle. "We're not done yet, boy. Stay with me," he murmured. Valor, though clearly in pain, pushed himself up to stand, ears pricked forward and head turning sharply to check the swirling white beyond them. His breath came in hard bursts, and his amber eyes were alert despite the exhaustion. Jack knew that look Valor was still scanning for threats, even as blood matted his fur. Jack slid one arm under the dog's chest and braced him against his own side. Together, they moved into the tree line, leaving the cabin and its broken door behind. The forest beyond was a maze of shadow and snowdrifts. Branches heavy with ice drooped low, creating archways that rattled when the wind shoved through them. Jack let Valor take the lead when the path narrowed, trusting the dog's instincts more than his own in this whitewashed labyrinth. Valor's pace was steady but cautious, every so often pausing to test the air, then adjusting their direction by a few feet to avoid open patches or treacherous slopes. Jack understood Valor was keeping them away from the most obvious routes, the ones their pursuers might expect them to take. The cold was a creeping thing, seeping in through Jack's coat and gloves, but it was Valor's condition that worried him most. To keep the dog focused and conscious, he kept talking, low and constant. "You remember last winter out by Ridge Lake? You went straight through the ice after that goose," he said, voice cracking with a faint laugh. "Scared the hell out of me. You paddled out like it was nothing." Valor gave a faint huff at the sound of his voice, and Jack squeezed his shoulder gently, keeping him close. Not far away, Claire Bennett was forcing her way through the undergrowth, her headlamp beam flickering against the trunks of snow-coated pines. The siren's echo had faded into the storm, leaving her with only the sound of her own breathing and the hiss of wind. She pushed through a low-hanging branch and froze. There, in the churned-up snow ahead, was a trail-deep prints from boots she recognized as police issue, and alongside them a staggered set of paw prints. Her chest tightened when she saw the darker stains in the snow, blood. It was spaced out in a way that told her the injured animal was still moving, not dragging. Relief flickered in her eyes. Jack and Valor were alive. She knelt, pressing her gloved fingers against the paw prints. The size and spacing were unmistakable for Valor. Standing, she adjusted the strap of her kit and pressed forward, now angling herself to follow their path rather than taking the direct line to the cabin. She knew if they'd left it, there was a reason and likely danger still nearby. Back in the trees, Jack stopped briefly under the shelter of a thick spruce, crouching with Valor tucked close to block some of the wind. He took a moment to press his gloved hand against the dog's ribs, feeling the steady rise and fall. The wound at Valor's shoulder had slowed its bleeding thanks to the cold, but Jack knew that same cold could kill if they didn't keep moving. His own legs ached, but Valor's safety came first. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a faint sound branches snapping under a weight that wasn't theirs. Jack's head turned, but Valor had already felt it. His ears twitched and his head swung back toward the sound, body stiffening. Jack whispered, "Easy. We keep moving." Valor didn't growl, but his gaze stayed fixed on that direction as they veered off the faint trail into a narrow gully choked with snow and fallen logs. The detour was grueling. Snow reached up to Jack's thighs in some places, and Valor had to scramble over tangled limbs slick with ice. Still, the dog's choices kept them out of the open, forcing any would-be follower to guess their path. Jack's trust in him was absolute. This was why they'd survived years together, why they were still alive now. The gully eventually spat them out into a sheltered hollow, ringed with pines whose branches nearly touched at the top, forming a natural roof that cut the wind in half. Jack guided Valor to a drift piled against a large trunk and sat down beside him, wrapping both arms around the dog and pulling him close. He pressed his cheek briefly against Valor's head, feeling the coarse fur and the heat still radiating under the cold. "We'll catch our breath here. Just for a bit," he whispered, though he knew they couldn't stop long. Somewhere in the dark, not far off, Claire was closing in. She had seen the boot prints veer into the gully and followed without hesitation, using the uneven ground to shield her approach from sight. The sound of the wind was less here, replaced by the soft crunch of snow under her boots and the rhythmic thud of her heart. She paused at the edge of the hollow, scanning the shadowed space ahead for movement. The smell of smoke lingered faintly on the air, a remnant of the cabin perhaps, but over it was something stronger, the metallic tang of blood and the distinct, comforting scent of a working dog. She knew she was close. Valor's head lifted a fraction before Jack heard anything. The dog's ears angled toward the edge of the hollow, his gaze locking there, but there was no tension in his body this time, only recognition. Jack tightened his grip on the pistol still tucked in his coat, waiting. The blizzard shifted and a beam of light cut into the hollow. Jack's eyes narrowed against it, ready for trouble. The figure that emerged from the darkness was bundled in a parka and carrying a medical kit, her face flushed from the cold, hairline damp where melted snow had slipped under her hood. Claire's eyes met his, relief breaking across her features as she took in the sight of both him and Valor alive. Jack let out a long breath, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Claire," he said simply, his voice rough from the cold and exhaustion. "You're both still standing," she replied, stepping forward into the shelter. "Let's keep it that way." The hollow between the snow-laden pines gave them a brief reprieve from the wind, but the stillness was brittle, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. Jack crouched low beside Valor while Claire knelt to open her trauma kit, her gloved hands moving with brisk precision. She pulled back the edge of the dog's matted fur, revealing the torn flesh of his shoulder. Her eyes narrowed, though her voice remained calm. "It's deep, but not through the muscle. He can move on it, just not too much strain." She worked quickly, flushing the wound with antiseptic from a squeeze bottle, wrapping it with a strip of gauze before securing it with a field bandage. Valor stood without prompting once she was done, giving a small shake before looking toward the north, ears forward. Jack's attention followed the same direction. The faint crunch of snow carried to them, different from the constant hiss of the storm. Multiple sets of boots, slow but deliberate. "They're coming back," he murmured. Claire zipped the kit and slung it over her shoulder, her face set. A plan came together in the space between breaths. The terrain here favored them, a narrow approach into the hollow from the north, flanked by a fallen spruce and a boulder half buried in snow. Jack pointed to the spruce. "Claire, take cover there. Stay low. If they pass you, circle behind." He glanced at Valor, whose steady gaze met his own. "You go with me." They took position, the cold biting into every exposed inch of skin. The snow muted everything, making the waiting feel longer than it was. Then shapes emerged. 3 men in dark parkas, masks drawn high over their faces. The leader was easy to spot. He moved with a certain authority, tall and thick through the chest, his gloved hand steady on the rifle slung across him. This was Darren Holt, a man Jack recognized from a wanted bulletin months back ex-military, dishonorably discharged for violent conduct, now running security for black market shipments. His eyes were pale blue, the kind that didn't blink much, and his jaw worked slowly as if he were chewing over what to do next. The men paused, scanning the hollow. Jack stayed low, letting them step deeper in before moving. Claire waited until the last man passed her position before she slid silently from cover, looping behind them. Valor tensed. muscles coiled. Jack whispered, "Now." The German Shepherd burst from behind the boulder with a growl that cut through the storm, snow spraying under his paws. He slammed into Holt's side, his jaws locking around the man's gun arm. The rifle clattered into the snow as Holt roared, trying to shake the dog free. But Valor held fast, his weight and momentum dragging the bigger man down to one knee. Jack charged in, tackling Holt fully to the ground, using the dog's grip to control the man's movement. One of the other gunmen spun at the commotion, only to find Claire behind him, swinging a heavy branch she'd grabbed from the ground. It cracked against his shoulder, sending him stumbling forward into the snow. The third man raised his pistol, but Jack, still grappling with Holt, kicked out hard, catching the man in the knee. The shot went wild, muffled by the storm, and Claire was on him in the next heartbeat, using her boot to knock the weapon from his hand. Holt tried to roll free, but Valor shifted his grip, clamping down harder until the man's resistance broke. Jack wrenched Holt's arms behind his back, using a zip tie from Claire's kit to secure his wrists. "Not so tough without your gun," Jack said, his breath coming in sharp bursts from the exertion. The other two gunmen lay face down in the snow, one groaning, the other silent except for the rasp of his breathing. Claire kept her foot on the nearest man's shoulder, her own breathing heavy but controlled. Jack gave Valor a quick once-over. The dog's chest heaved, but his stance was steady, eyes still alert. Jack crouched and gave him a firm pat. "You did good, partner. Real good." With Holt secured and the other two disarmed, they pulled the men closer together, out of immediate sight from the main path. Jack knew the storm could both hide them and trap them if they lingered too long, but for the moment, they'd turn the tables. The sound of the siren was still faint in the distance, but now it was coming closer, more distinct. Jack glanced at Claire. "We've got time to get them ready for pickup. Once they're in custody, we can move." Claire nodded, tightening the restraints on the second man while Jack checked Holt's pockets for any intel. Valor stood nearby, his head turning slowly as he kept watch over the tree line, every muscle still on guard for another attack. The sirens grew louder until red and blue lights pulsed through the wall of snow, reflecting off the trunks of the pines. The blizzard had softened, the wind no longer screaming but sighing in long, weary breaths. Jack stood with Claire near the three restrained men, Valor sitting beside him, his coat dusted with frost, and his bandaged shoulder darkening with fresh spots of blood. The first vehicle to break through the trees was a dark green Pine Hollow Sheriff's Department SUV, its tires throwing up arcs of powder. Two deputies emerged, bundled in heavy parkas and tactical vests. One was Deputy Ryan Calloway, a stocky man in his mid-30s with a shaved head and a no-nonsense expression. The other was Mara Lopez, a tall, lean officer in her late 20s whose dark hair was braided tightly beneath a knit cap. She had sharp, watchful eyes that missed nothing, her demeanor calm but edged with quiet steel. Ryan took one look at Holt and his men and gave a low whistle. "Looks like you've been busy, Rourke." His gaze flicked to Valor, and a rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. "And I see your partner's still in one piece." Jack offered a tired nod. "Couldn't have done it without him." Mara knelt to check the restraints on the prisoners, her gloved hands working quickly. "We'll get them transported back. EMS is already en route for the dog." Her eyes shifted to Claire, recognition sparking. "Good to see you still throwing yourself into trouble, Bennett." Claire smirked faintly, though her eyes stayed on Valor. "Only when it's worth it." Within minutes, more vehicles arrived, the flashing lights piercing the white gloom. Paramedics moved in, one of them, a sandy-haired man in his 40s named Dr. Evan Harlow, immediately crouching beside Valor. Harlow was known in Pine Hollow for his steady manner and quiet competence. He'd treated countless working dogs and understood their silent resilience. His hands were gentle but firm as he examined the wound. "He's stable for transport, but we'll need to operate as soon as we're back." Jack kept his hand on Valor's neck as they loaded him onto the sled stretcher. The dog's amber eyes stayed fixed on him until the medics closed the rear doors of the transport vehicle. The drive back into town felt surreal. The storm had broken enough to let the first pale streaks of morning through the clouds. Pine Hollow emerged from the haze, its rooftops capped with fresh snow, the streets quiet except for the crunch of tires. At the clinic, Harlow and his team moved quickly, prepping Valor for surgery. Jack stayed in the waiting area with Claire, their jackets still dusted with snow. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It carried the weight of shared relief. Finally, Claire spoke. "You know, you could have called for backup before charging into the woods." Jack gave a dry chuckle. "You know me better than that." "I do," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. There was something unspoken there, a thread that had been frayed for years starting to weave itself back together. Hours later, Harlow emerged, pulling off his gloves. "He's going to be fine. Tough dog. Stitches and rest, but he'll make a full recovery." Relief swept through Jack so strongly he had to sit down. When they brought Valor out, still groggy but alert enough to wag his tail faintly, Jack knelt beside him and murmured, "You're not going back on duty, partner. From now on, you're home with me." The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, interviews, and slow recovery. Claire stopped by daily, sometimes with coffee, sometimes just to sit with Jack and Valor. The connection between her and Jack began to feel less like a rekindling and more like something that had been waiting quietly, patient for the right moment. A week later, the town gathered in front of the Pine Hollow courthouse. The sky was clear, the snow glittering in the winter sunlight. The mayor, a tall, silver-haired man named George Weller, stood on the steps with a microphone, his voice carrying over the assembled crowd. "Today, we honor one of Pine Hollow's own. Valor, a member of our K-9 unit, showed extraordinary bravery in the face of grave danger. He not only saved the life of his handler, Deputy Jack Rourke, but also played a critical role in the capture of dangerous criminals operating in our region." Applause rippled through the crowd as Jack stepped forward with Valor at his side. The dog wore a fresh bandage but stood tall, ears perked, tail wagging slowly. George bent to place a custom-made medal on Valor's collar, the polished silver catching the sun. Cameras flashed, children clapped, and someone in the crowd shouted, "Good boy, Valor!" Jack couldn't help the faint smile tugging at his lips. For all the danger, the cold and the blood, it felt worth it in that moment. He leaned down, scratching behind Valor's ears. "You're done with all that now. From here on out, you're just family." The ceremony ended with townsfolk coming forward to thank them both. Jack and Claire stood together, Valor between them, and as the sun climbed higher over Pine Hollow, the weight of the past days began to lift. The storm had passed, and in its place was the quiet warmth of home, trust restored, and the knowledge that even in the harshest winter, there could be a dawn worth waiting for. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive with trumpets or bright lights. They come in the form of loyalty that refuses to break, courage that rises even in the face of pain, and people, or animals, placed in our path exactly when we need them most. I believe that God's hand was in the bond between Jack and Valor, guiding them through the storm, giving them the strength to hold on until the dawn. In our daily lives, we may not face snowstorms or armed criminals, but we all encounter moments when the world feels cold and heavy. It is in those moments that God often sends us help through a friend's words, a stranger's kindness, or the unwavering love of a faithful companion. We just have to be willing to see it and to believe it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, subscribe for more stories that inspire, and may God bless and protect you and your loved ones always. If you believe in the power of faith, loyalty, and love, type Amen in the comments.